We're delighted to be before you and to wrestle with a rather important issue. Let me say something about what we're trying to do this afternoon, perhaps by saying what we're not trying to do. This is not another scholarly convention that appraises the still fairly recently elected President of the United States. There are plenty of views about him in Washington, and I think there are one or two views beyond this city in the United States about him and what he's doing and the challenges that lie ahead. This is not another of those occasions. This is where we draw upon scholars and experts whose field is outside the United States and look in on Washington, on the new administration, and understand how it seems from those perspectives. So during the course of the afternoon, we're going to be looking at what has happened in the last 6 months and what might happen in the next 12 under the new team here from the perspective of Berlin, from the angle of Tehran, from Moscow, from Riyadh, and so forth. So we are outside looking in, not inside looking out. And there is a phrase which is quite dear to me and I think relevant to this particular occasion that comes from the great poet of British Empire, who was rather prescient in many ways, Rudyard Kipling, who had early on in the period of empire this to say: what does he, I think he meant she as well, they weren't so particular in the 19th century, what does he of England know who only England knows? And we, in this session this afternoon, are thinking about America in perspective, in global perspective, how others see us. What, for example, do people in Beijing and Berlin imagine they might be able to secure by way of strategic objectives, by way of goals, under the new American administration that was not possible before? What kind of new risks are associated with the incumbent? Does the legendary deal-making capacity associated with him offer potential of a kind that was not available under previous presidents? Those are the sorts of things we're going to be looking at. And our first session begins with Asia Pacific, focusing closely on the Chinese-speaking world and the more diverse world of Southeast Asia. And to talk us through some of the key issues at stake as seen from those vectors, let me just very briefly, because details are provided in the book, introduce to my right, your left, Doug Paul from the Carnegie Endowment, who will make some opening remarks, followed by Catherine Dalpino, adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. What we want to do is, having listened to them, interrogate them and exchange views between ourselves. Why should we bother about this? Isn't this rather arcane? Well, let me just remind you of one or two things, if I may. Asia Pacific is that part of the world responsible for the largest share of global growth. That share is going to grow. It is responsible for nearly half of the world's population. That too is going to grow. It's Asia Pacific that constitutes the corridors of trade, capital, human, and financial flows on a scale which are nearly unsurpassed. And above all, I suppose, for the purposes of our conversation this afternoon, Asia Pacific is that area of great strategic contention between the United States on the one hand and its allies and the People's Republic of China, and without allies, one might say, on the other hand. So this is not a matter to feel indifferent about. This is not an issue on which we should have no views or no interests. What we want to do, and we're going to finish sharply at 2:50, is end up with a fuller picture and understanding of what is at stake here from the outside looking in. That's enough from me. Doug, would you start us off?
Happy to do so. I see a few friends among the audience here today. Glad to be among you, and thank you for the invitation. The question you've posed is is really a good one. I, last year, was engaged in speaking engagements around the Asia-Pacific region. And it was a really interesting experience because Washington was so conventionally and overwhelmingly committed to the prospect that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election and that Donald Trump had no chance. That where I spoke in Asia, whether it's Hong Kong or Taiwan, Korea, China, everywhere I went, there was a full expectation that Trump had a very good chance to win, and that in many ways was the preferable candidate. And this was particularly true in China, not in Taiwan, but not in Japan, but certainly in China. The Chinese felt that they, being a culture that prides itself on pragmatism, would have a pragmatic American businessman to deal with. And so this persisted. It didn't waver even when he had some terrible weeks during the campaign. People were convinced that he was better than Hillary because she would bring women's issues and human rights and ideological baggage into the White House that they did not want to have to deal with. Lo and behold, when the election came, and they were, the ambassador here, I'm told, had predicted, which ambassadors, by the way, should never do, had predicted the outcome of an American election in the wrong direction. He was desperate. He didn't have any reach to anybody in the campaign, even though the climate in China was receptive to Trump as a potential partner. They didn't know who to talk to, how to deal with this. And then very shortly afterward, as many of you will be aware, Trump received a call from the president of Taiwan offering congratulations. And he took that call, which was unprecedented, and then he complicated it more with a press interview with Fox TV explaining that, well, we don't need this one China policy, we got to trade for things, do better. And that was sort of rocking the pins of policy. Poor Cui Tiankai, the ambassador here in Washington, didn't know what to do or to whom to turn in the transition period. They sent a senior official, and they were received at Trump Tower, and they proceeded to lecture the Trump people, Bannon, Kushner, then Flynn, on principles of U.S.-China relations, and you should get them right, and we're not going to talk to you until you get them right. That didn't produce a very good result in the instance. Then Cui had the thought of talking to Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger had the thought of giving them Jared Kushner's phone number. And since then, the ambassador Cui Tiankai has been flying in the air with success. For a period leading to a revisit to plan the Mar-a-Lago summit, he was on the phone virtually every hour with Jared Kushner, making this detail and that detail right for his boss to go well. And in the process, the boss, Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Communist Party, designated Cui, who was supposed to retire in March this year, to continue on for another year because he so successfully deployed personal diplomacy to get China in. Now, the problem with this is they've now had the Mar-a-Lago summit, and they declare their successes to be the two very strong personalities nonetheless found a way to have some chemistry, to communicate, to treat each other with respect. Secondly, they've come up with a four-part dialogue mechanism to refine what we had before on the big issues. And third, to agree on a consensus that North Korea should be pressed to denuclearize. Those are the sum and substance of the summit. But now the Chinese are kind of caught up with, a trite expression for China, the sweet and sour mood. The sweet came out of Mar-a-Lago, well-treated, opportunity to talk at the very top, being received in the key offices in Washington. But the sour is they see this doesn't have a good ending. We've got now a 100-day program to prepare for the economic and trade bilateral meeting here in Washington in June, July. And Trump has talked about forgiving China for its sins on currency and trade if they'd help us on North Korea. But what we want from China on North Korea, China will not deliver. They want the North to be pressed to the point where it actually denuclearizes. China will not do that because the cost to China would be the loss of the regime, the partner regime in North Korea. They're not friends, but they are a buffer between American allied South Korea and China, and you can understand the strategic logic of that. So the Chinese are not going to deliver what Trump wants. Moreover, Trump has been doubling down. He had his Secretary of State up at the UN last week, as if the highest priority in the world and our first measure of success of the Trump regime is going to be to do what no president has been able to do prior to this with all sorts of inducements and threats. So I think we're headed towards a real mismatch of expectations. And if Trump is true to his behavior in the past and some of his statements, we're likely to see this expressed in a cascade of trade actions against China. Countervailing duties, voluntary restraint agreements, which China can agree to, 232 findings under national security protection, and 301 findings, which are supposed to be WTO illegal, but can be deployed under our law, and some other authorities that they're poking around in. So we could end up having that trade war, which we thought we missed with the Mar-a-Lago summit, come back and be related to something which has nothing to do with trade, which is the situation in North Korea. Now let me jump quickly to Japan. Tokyo, Prime Minister Abe was convinced that he was going to get Hillary Clinton, like everybody else in Washington was. And so he had scheduled a visit to the US on the way to the Peru APEC summit in November. And he had a day scheduled to stop in and see Hillary Clinton in New York. Luckily, Trump is also from New York, and so they were able not to change his itinerary and plead to get a meeting at Trump Tower, and they succeeded in doing that. And that has blossomed into a Mar-a-Lago summit for the Japanese even before Xi Jinping got to the... And the Japanese were able to come and go from that meeting without a single ask being put on them on the trade or economic front, and without a single give. They were prepared to come with $60–70 billion in investments and concessions. And they didn't have to do any of it, they just played golf. So the Japanese feel they've got something good going here, and if they see trouble between the US and China, which they don't see yet, they'll be even happier. Okay. And then in Korea, we've got a really complicated situation where there's been an impeachment, there's now an election underway, and we've had this outbreak of amateurism by Trump himself on the question of Korea. First, we've set an impossible goal of achieving denuclearization of Korea, or disappearance of the North Korean regime. And then we've got a missile emplacement, THAAD defensive system, which we've fast forwarded to the new government because we were afraid the new government may disapprove it. And so we want to get it in place in South Korea. And then Trump, this is an American system to be owned by America on Korean territory. But then Trump changed the tune of music and said, no, we want to have that be paid for by the Koreans. If you were trying to mess up an election, and try to disadvantage yourself and make sure that somebody who's not on the same wavelength with you gets elected, he's doing everything perfectly.
Yep.
We had this happen before, back in 2003, when the president was elected shortly after an American court-martial found innocent two tank drivers who had run over small children and killed them during an exercise. And this is setting up a comparable outcome where despite unhappiness with China in South Korea, despite people's desire to keep the US relationship, we are putting issues before the voters that are pushing them in the direction of people who will reject the THAAD missile system and diminish the alliance.
Good. Thank you for sketching out that strategic landscape. We'll come back to some of the critical issues there, not least North Korea, and we want to talk also about China's rather considerable maritime claims, which have alarmed so many of the countries that Catherine in particular specializes on. I don't know whether you want to start there or some other considerations, but share some ideas with us if you would, and we will then pick away at them.
Thank you. I'll get to the South China Sea sooner rather than later, but let me just say something about the region in general in terms of the new administration. Southeast Asia is invariably nervous whenever there's a change of a U.S. administration. And I would say that their nervousness about this is through the roof at this present time. Unlike China, the region was pretty predisposed to have a President Clinton. She had distinguished herself with Southeast Asia in the Obama administration as being one of the participants in the pivot. She helped to reform U.S. policy towards Myanmar, and she strongly articulated U.S. views about the South China Sea. That said, I think it's very important that we not look at the United States and China in Southeast Asia as zero-sum. because whenever the United States creates a policy space, it is not a given that necessarily China is going to be able to occupy that space. Among other things, there is going to be, I think, a greater push for activity in Japan. I think that Prime Minister Abe is poised to provide that. Also, perhaps Australia, and even more, a little bit more of a bump up in Russia and India, although they have far more narrower scope in the region. But certainly the South China Sea is where Vietnam and Singapore in particular feel the most nervousness. And one reason is that there have been so many contradictory statements coming out of the Trump administration, whether it's Secretary Tillerson's confirmation hearing statement that the United States would blockade islands, disputed islands that China attempted to militarize, and then having Secretary of Defense Mattis say, oh, don't pay any attention to that. But I think that there are a couple of fundamental worries. One is that there are so many moving parts in the South China Sea conflicts. It really does require a slow and steady policy. And slow and steady is not the way most people would describe the Trump administration's foreign policy thus far. And the second is that the fungibility of policy is a little bit nervous making to Southeast Asia. Specifically, they fear that the United States may give ground to China over the South China Sea in order to get gains in other policy areas, whether they're trade or perhaps Korea. And this is, as I said, particularly worrisome for Vietnam and for Singapore, perhaps less so from the Philippines. We could have a whole conference about President Duterte, but I think that over time, since we're looking, my money actually on this is on the U.S. Pacific Command and the Department of Defense. Even though they have had their freedom of navigation requests turned down so far from the White House, I think that if, at some point, if particularly the Pacific Command sees enough flashpoints or warning signs, they will make a push with the White House. Doug mentioned, talked extensively, I think justifiably, about North Korea. We were fairly excited last weekend when President Trump made phone calls to 4 Southeast Asian leaders and then offered invitations to the White House to them, until we heard a readout that his intent was to line them up on North Korea policy. He's barking up the wrong tree on this. The region can't really deliver anything on North Korea policy, even though ASEAN periodically invites Pyongyang to participate in the ASEAN Regional Forum. And they are likely to be as worried as China about any sanctions that would affect them on North Korea. So if that is the focus of the new interest in Southeast Asia in the Trump administration this week, I think that it's not going to be very fruitful. There is one thing that the United States can do in Southeast Asia that China cannot, and that will be of great value to countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, perhaps the Philippines, and that is the strong push against ISIS. And here it's a very complicated issue because, of course, there are soft power problems with this administration related to statements made about Muslims and also the impact of the 2 executive orders. There were no Southeast Asian countries mentioned in those executive orders, but the net result was pretty much the same. But the governments of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore very much want a strong United States participation in this. China certainly does not line up on ISIS' side, and it has worries related to some of their Uyghur extremists, but they aren't positioned as the United States is to take on this issue. The one way in which the United States will not participate, I will say, is in infrastructure in Southeast Asia. We are really not much of a player in that in the region because our packages are too expensive and we don't give the concessionary financing deals that Japan, South Korea, and China do. So if China's one belt, one road policy is mostly public relations, they are nevertheless making inroads in Southeast Asia on this, particularly in Myanmar, perhaps in Malaysia, also Indonesia, and episodically in Thailand. And we're going to have to look to Japan and to South Korea if we want to see anybody counterbalance that in the region, I think. Let me also say that there are some Southeast Asian leaders that are hopeful that the Trump administration will not come down as heavily on human rights. I think that's justified. We haven't seen that across the board, but I do think that we will see a continued push on religious freedom, which has been an element of U.S. human rights policy in U.S. foreign policy for over 20 years. And Vice President Pence, when he went to Indonesia 2 weeks ago, certainly did demonstrate that. The Trump administration is raising hopes and fears on the trade front in Southeast Asia. Initially, many Southeast Asian countries, those that were not in the TPP, welcomed this new emphasis on bilateral trade deals over multilateral ones. Obviously, Vietnam and Malaysia were deeply disappointed with the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP, but nevertheless hoping to gain some trade preferences through bilateral. I think that Southeast Asia is going to be disappointed. Bilateral trade negotiations are usually much more domestically controversial. There was a lubricant in the TPP that will not be there. For example, I know that interim President Prayut in Bangkok is hopeful that he can revive the U.S.-Thailand free trade agreement. That was pretty much euthanized in 2006 for domestic Thai reasons. I see nothing in Thailand that is going to make it more acceptable at this point. So I think that probably that's not going to come to fruition. Moreover, 4 Southeast Asian countries were tagged as trade cheats, got letters, and so they're trying to figure out where that leaves them. Let me leave with a somewhat hopeful note. In the policy structure, in the foreign affairs agencies, the State Department, USTR, even the White House, even the National Security Council, those who are responsible for Southeast Asia tend to be career and not political appointees. The one exception to that is the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Department of Defense. And so there is a certain amount of stability within that policy apparatus. I think that will provide continuity for U.S. relations with Southeast Asia. Even the Southeast Asia director in the National Security Council is usually detailed from one of the other foreign affairs agencies. The question will be, can this more career level have access and any influence over the political levels? And we just don't know that yet.
Okay.
So.
Do you want to just put a little bit out there on the South China Sea before we move to a wider conversation? Take it from this angle, if you would. Is, as far as some of the Southeast Asia claimants of this territory concerned, Trump potentially good news, bad news, or indifferent?
I think bad news for Vietnam on the South China Sea, because Vietnam has already taken some measures and gotten some grief from China since the election. China is putting a ban on Vietnamese fishing for the next 6 months, even in waters that Vietnam believes are its own. And that's sort of episodic. Vietnam probably is the only claimant country in Southeast Asia that has a hope of having some kind of fairly independent self-defense on this. I think that if you look at the Philippines, Indonesia certainly, which is not a claimant but does have some maritime worries, even Malaysia, they are going to need help with their Coast Guard facilities. Vietnam is not waiting for that. And so even though it is probably the most disadvantaged, it's also probably going to do the most about it. The opposite of that would be the strange turnarounds from Manila and President Duterte, who also this year, it's important and significant because Manila is chairing ASEAN. We have just seen in the ASEAN summit in Manila at the end of April a very anodyne statement about the South China Sea. This is sort of the norm. I mean, after 2012 and Cambodia's wholesale capitulation to China, we're not going to see maritime security not be on the ASEAN agenda. But Duterte has studiously avoided any mention of the UNCLOS decision last year, which was in Manila's favor. And I think that's a very good indication of how he will handle ASEAN. That said, he is flipping out a little bit. I mean, he had a 3-day period in April in which he said he was ordering Philippine troops to all disputed islands, and then 3 days later said, never mind. So we have two sort of equally curious and unstable hands on this town.
We welcome comments, observations, questions, criticism. We draw the line at abuse and assassination, but please feel free to quiz the speakers about things they've said, about things that they haven't. I'm going to, whilst you think about that, just throw a few pebbles into the pond by way of a start. I mean, the picture I'm getting from both of you essentially is one of the ways in which the Trump presidency has discombobulated leaders, with the possible exception of Japan, which is rather comfortable with the way things are going, they're cast as passive. They're cast of being affected by rather than doing anything reactive or taking the initiative. Now, if, for example, Doug, we thought about China's strategic objectives, these matter a great deal in this year in particular for Xi Jinping. They matter in terms of the wider vision of the Chinese Communist Party, thinking about a centenary of its birth before too very long. We still have the situation of Taiwan beyond the fold. This is completely unacceptable in Beijing. Why could we not, if we were in Beijing, think to ourselves, right, with Mr. Trump here, might we advance our agenda a little bit? Could we, for example, if Mr. Trump is open to a deal, could it be something South China Sea versus arms to Taiwan? Could it be North Korea versus a different policy on Taiwan? Is there something here that we could seize and run with?
I think you're right to ask about strategic objectives. Xi Jinping this year is looking for a sequence of stagings of his emergence as the apotheosized leader of China in November. And so we had an important speech where he claimed a major role in global governance at Davos. That he came to Mar-a-Lago and showed he could stand toe-to-toe with the world's most powerful country and come out all right. In a week or so, he'll be holding the BRICS and the Belt and Road Summit with some 30 leaders in Beijing. That'll be a big showcase for Xi Jinping. And on August 1st, they're going to have the anniversary of the PLA. They're going to march 20,000 or more troops down Tiananmen Square, saluting Xi Jinping. That's what this year is about. What I worry about is next year, so you're right to ask the questions, and I can see them putting things in place. We've had a number of personnel changes on the Taiwan policy front. I'm an old Taiwan hand. If you read my biography, I did a lot of work there. They're putting in people who are stars in the Chinese system, in jobs where normally you don't put stars, responsible for the Taiwan policy area. I think they're thinking very strategically, thinking of changing the framework within which they deal with Taiwan and being very forward against us. I can't prove that now. I just see personnel moves that suggest to me, watch this space. It's getting risky. Now, Abe, on his part, sees this opportunity right now to take Japan toward constitutional revision, and he announced that yesterday as a straightforward objective. He will have the votes soon in both houses of the Diet to be able to pass constitutional revision. I never thought that would come. It's come already. And he can use the excuse of the deteriorating security environment. Now, I'm doing a little of an op-ed piece right now on, if we keep doing what we're doing with South Korea, we could end up with a very strained and ineffective alliance with the South Koreans at a time when we're ratcheting up pressure on North Korea, when Abe needs an excuse to change the constitution to give himself more of a normal military role, which Japan has abjured since 1947, and we can have China reacting to all of that in ways that can be very disturbing.